what worries me at the moment is that, and I know all the imperfections that we have of it, but you know, the order that we created post 1945 of international law and an understanding of sovereignty, an understanding of territorial integrity of states, an understanding of the independence of states, I think is really, really being challenged at the moment. And obviously, the war in Ukraine is a very good example of this. But I think there's a number of other things that we've seen, which has made me very, very nervous about this. That are we actually starting to move back into an era of the 19th century might is right?
On this episode of the What the Finance podcast, I have the pleasure of welcoming on Professor James Ker-Lindsay, who is a research associate at the London School of Economics and visiting professor at the University of Kent. He also holds a PhD in international conflict analysis and has published dozens of books sort of on this topic. So, James, thanks so much for coming on the podcast today.
Thanks so much.
No problem. And I forgot to mention that you have a very good YouTube channel as well, which discusses all these topics. So that's a great place to maybe get an introduction to James. But I guess my first question, it does really seem like we're living in turbulent times. There's a lot more conflict occurring globally. It could be within countries. It could be, externally. And it seems very destabilizing in terms of the international sphere of things. So I guess in your opinion, is this what's happening? Is it the fact that things are more uncertain and more turbulent, or is this maybe just more a recency bias?
I would say that it certainly is getting a lot more turbulent. I mean, the reason I was a bit hesitant there was because it was about sort of giving away my age, but I'm 51 now. And so my formative years were really spent during the Cold War and the latter stages of the Cold War. So, really, I guess the 1980s. And this was when I was becoming really interested in politics, international politics. I was one of those kids who was just really into this sort of stuff. And so, sort of drove the later career. But I guess I'm trying to say is that I think we can I would identify sort of maybe 3 or 4 eras that I was very aware of. And each came with its own elements of stability, instability, if you like. So, when I was growing up, it was Cold War. And it was a very odd time. It was a very scary time that, I think the generations now don't really quite understand that. I mean, this sort of threat of nuclear war and things like that. I mean, as a child, it felt very real. And we were sort of acutely aware of it. But also there was that odd stability within the international system looking back of, the superpowers, that there were obviously these sort of conflicts that would take place in certain places. So, for example, I often say that anyone who studies conflict, there are certain formative conflicts which in many ways have sort of shaped them and their understanding of the world and the way they look at it. And in my case, it might come as a bit of a surprise for many people who sort of know me and know the sort of conflicts that I work on. So I tend to work mainly on Greece, Turkey, Cyprus, and on the Western Balkans, so Southeast Europe. But the conflict that was really, really stood out for me in the 1980s was Lebanon, which was, really, really in the heart of news, especially in the UK. I mean, partly because there were Lebanese hostage crises, and Terry Waite, who was the Archbishop of Canterbury's special envoy, who was kept hostage, what was it, 5-6 years, and so it was sort of quite a big news item, and I remember very much that. But essentially, that was taking place within the context of the broader Cold War. Then, of course, we got to the 1990s and the end of the Cold War. And then suddenly we saw a new era of sort of instability in places. And, the conflicts there that, really stand out, of course, we'd be talking the wars in Yugoslavia. But also, I remember that Somalia was a hugely important issue. And it was also a very telling issue because it was this era that the United States, especially in those first few years of the 1990s, thought that, look, the Cold War's over, we've won, we're the hyperpower. And then they got a bloody nose in trying to manage the situation in Somalia. But there was also a sense that this was an era of optimistic peacekeeping, that yes, we had all these new conflicts that were emerging, but somehow, the UN was going to do a lot more, and it was this proliferation of peacekeeping missions. And then we got into the stage of, I think, the US pushing it just too far, Iraq being the obvious case in this. And now we're entering, I think, I'm reevaluating, because I thought that if Afghanistan, the US pullout from Afghanistan, really marked the end of the post-Cold War era. I don't know what we're going to call this new era. But then we saw the war in Ukraine, and in some ways, I think that that's forcing many of us to sort of reevaluate. Were we too hasty to call it the end of this sort of US era of domination, and that we were sort of talking about this era of, multipolarity, and we thought Russia was going to be a sort of a rising power alongside China and others. And of course, I think what we've seen is that Russia, because of what's happened in Ukraine, has been squeezed significantly. It's not the power that I think a lot of us thought it was, remembering, of course, that, even before the invasion of Ukraine, the feeling was this would be a walkover. Russia absolutely was going to win this very quickly. And then we'd have to deal with, the consequences of that on the world stage. And that actually hasn't been quite the case. And instead, the debate seems to have moved into more of this sort of debate about, is it the United States versus China? I think there's a little less of that sort of multipolarity, although we're talking obviously about the BRICS as well and where they feature in on it. But I think that's a different debate in terms of economics. But in terms of sort of military discussions and things, I think, we're in a very, very strange time, that even the assumptions, as I say, I think we were making a couple of years ago with the end of, the end of Afghanistan, and that, where we were going, I think now really questioning. So this is all a very long answer to say that, yes, we are in a period of instability, but I think that to say that it's unprecedented or anything, I think each era has had its instability, that especially as I've sort of grown up and gone through my career, and especially been interested in conflict. And I think this is just maybe unstable, because it's not the stability or instability that we were used to, if you see what I mean. So yeah, I think I'd say this is an uncertainty, but whether it's inherently more unstable than what we've seen at other times, or more threatening, I think it's a bit difficult to tell.
Yeah, it's really interesting how you sort of compare it to those previous stages. And I guess, as you said, if we compare it to the previous stage of sort of I guess you'd say 2000s, maybe late 90s, to where we were a few years ago, that seems a lot different to where we are today. So I guess in terms of where we are, what would you say it reminds you of? Or I guess if you look in the history books, is there any similarities that we can join between where we are now and the past?
Well, it's interesting you should say that, because I think, I like a lot of people who work on international relations. I thought, what is my worldview? What is it that how do I see the world? And how would I want the world to be? And I think, from a normative perspective, so that how would I envisage a better situation? I think what worries me at the moment is that, and I know all the imperfections that we have of it, but the order that we created post 1945 of international law, and an understanding of sovereignty, an understanding of territorial integrity of states, an understanding of the independence of states, I think is really, really being challenged at the moment. And obviously the war in Ukraine is a very good example of this, but I think there's a number of other things that we've seen, which has made me very, very nervous about this. That are we actually starting to move back into an era of the 19th century might is right? And I think, one of the arguments that, obviously the war in Ukraine is having a huge, huge effect on this debate. And I think my sense is that, I worked on a number of peace processes throughout my career, and I inherently want to find ways to create peace. And I think that most conflicts you can find a way to get to peace. But But I also have started to think that we need to regard Ukraine as slightly different. So I hear these voices saying, "Oh, but we've got to persuade the sides to talk to each other and stuff." I actually rather think that and it's something, as I say, I've been thinking about a lot. That Ukraine is effectively what happens when you face a systemic war in an era of nuclear weapons. That by that I mean that the Second World War was a systemic war. It's where, and I know it sounds very trite and everything, but it's almost like a good versus evil. And I know a lot of people will be really upset because it's like, oh, how dare you say that the US is and NATO are good, and Russia is bad. It's not. So look, there is complexity, and I fully take on board that yes, the United States, NATO countries, have done a lot of bad things. Although I'm very cautious about saying this is NATO, because NATO is obviously an organization of 31 members now, many of which have very different cultures. I don't sort of see Norway as a particularly belligerent country. Finland doesn't have that reputation, other Baltic states. So, to say it's all NATO is the bad actor. But I think, we can obviously say, if we're to be honest, the United States, UK have had their sort of fair share of responsibility for, I think, breaking down the system of international law. And perhaps we can talk about that. But ultimately, where we are now, I think the Russian invasion of Ukraine is so fundamental to the future of the international system, and it has to be defeated. That we have to try and get back into a situation where the sanctity of state borders is recognized, respected, and that you can't just march in and seize territory and annex it. And I think people often lose sight of that. What Russia has done in Ukraine has absolutely gone beyond anything that we've seen any other country do since 1945. And people say, oh, but what about US and Iraq? Yes, US and Iraq was very serious and it was very damaging. But the United States never claimed that it was going to annex Iraq. It said, look, we don't like the regime there. It was a dangerous regime. And let's not, forget Saddam Hussein was a brutal dictator who had invaded. And funny enough, that was one of the other few examples of a country trying to annex another state in the modern system. So, you can say, right, okay, Iraq wasn't great. Saddam Hussein had been, a brutal dictator. But it stopped short of violating all the fundamental principles. What Russia has done in Ukraine has violated all of those. And I do really believe that if it's not defeated, if Russia is allowed to keep part of that territory as a result of it, then we are opening the door to a return to a very, very dangerous period in international relations, especially as, then states will start thinking themselves, well, the only option which is going to protect us against the powerful neighbor is nuclear weapons. And then we'll start to see proliferation of that. And are we then on the road to it will only be a matter of time before one of them is used? So I know it sounds very apocalyptic and everything like that, but I do think this war in Ukraine is perhaps far more serious than some of the people saying, oh, well, they should just sort of find a peaceful settlement. I think it goes a bit beyond that.
Yeah, and I guess you said it's setting that precedent where if Russia can do it, maybe Turkey can go into Syria, Iran can go into its neighbors, and
Precisely.
China, Taiwan's the classic example. So I guess is that what you're saying? This is like the one you have to fire at, because if you don't, there's just going to be all these other occurrences globally.
Yeah, absolutely. And listen, I hear all the whataboutery. I mean, it comes with the territory. And again, none of this is to say that the West hasn't done its things which have undermined international law. And a question that I follow very closely is, for example, Kosovo. And there I have a very sort of mixed view on it. Look, I mean, I never hid the fact, I wrote a book on it, that I felt that it was a very dangerous precedent that was set. And yet, strangely enough, I actually support the idea of an independent Kosovo. I think it makes sense for Serbia. I think it makes sense for Kosovo. But I was very, very critical about the way that it was done, because I felt that it opened the door. We had a certain principle about how states came into existence, and I think that this was a violation of that. And I remember sort of saying at the time, what really worries me about it is that this will then be used by other countries as a precedent for doing what they want to do. Maybe I over-egged it a bit, in hindsight, looking back, it wasn't But if you look how often Russia refers to Kosovo as the precedent, even though it doesn't recognize Kosovo, so it's just simply saying, look, we don't accept what you did. But by doing this, you have created the ability for us to do the same. If you're going to rewrite the rules of international relations and state creation, then we can do the same. And it doesn't mean that then we have to recognize Kosovo. We don't have to. And you don't have to recognize Crimea, but we've done it just as you did it there. So I think it's very problematic. And I was very concerned about this at the time. And again, this doesn't detract from the fact that, you know, I've been to Kosovo many times. As I say, I think that an independent Kosovo is ultimately beneficial for the region, and I hope that Serbia and Kosovo come to an agreement. And you know, we're seeing the tensions that are rising there again, but nevertheless, you can separate out the practical benefits of an independent Kosovo from the very worrying legal process, or some would say illegal process, that got to it. And I'm before any viewers start screaming up and down about the International Court of Justice case and whatever, yeah, I know all about it. I've written about it. It didn't actually say Kosovo as a state. It just said that declarations of independence, unless prohibited under sort of UN Security Council resolutions, aren't actually contrary to international law. So effectively, I could declare the room that I'm sitting in to be independent. It doesn't make it a state. It's just nothing under international law says that I can't do that, if you see what I mean. So Kosovo is a really, really interesting case that sort of comes into this. And I think, you know, sometimes Western policymakers neglect that. I think that self-reflection that they need to have to understand part of how we got to where we are. And I mean, this isn't trying to sort of forgive Russia for what it's doing at the moment. I'm very, very clear. But I do think that we want to return to many of the principles that we saw put in place post 1945. I mean, you know, the UN gets a lot of criticism, but I think, you know, this idea that if we were to scrap it or we were to go into an era where it was just completely irrelevant, I mean, it would be so dangerous. You know, and I'd like to see a return, but you know, some would argue that we can't. We've gone beyond that now. But again, I think defeating Russia in Ukraine would go a very long way to hopefully, if not a full reset, to actually sort of say, look, you know, this isn't going to be the way that we're going to handle international relations in you know, for the rest of the 21st century.
Yeah, and I guess we go to another conflict that's happening there at the moment in a similar area, Azerbaijan and Armenia, because that's something that's, I guess you could say, is quite similar, even though there's, I guess, examples of the past where Armenia took parts of Azerbaijan that was had Armenian demographics, but people could say that Azerbaijan is being the aggressor, yet there's no talk from the global, you know, sphere and almost the fact that not that they're supporting Azerbaijan, but that nothing's going to happen. So I'm not sure if you have any thoughts on what's happening there.
I mean, look, you know, this is a really interesting case that actually pulls together a lot of these things and also exposes many of the contradictions in terms of. So, from a legal point of view, there's no question that this is Azerbaijani territory. I mean, that much has been made clear repeatedly by Security Council resolutions. And this is something that we've seen, actually. A lot of countries have been saying, EU countries saying, look, we're not disputing the fact that this is Azerbaijani territory. But what it also highlights is that there is, as well as a legal understanding of sovereignty, there is also a belief, again, something that I fundamentally believe in, which is the peaceful resolution of disputes. And I think that this is where we've seen, quite rightly, Azerbaijan coming in for a lot of criticism for what it's done, that there was an effort to try and say, right, I mean, look, the reality of the situation is that Armenia had lost the war. And Nagorno-Karabakh had lost the war that was fought a few years ago. It was always then about the idea of an independent Republic of Nagorno-Karabakh, or Republic of Artsakh, as they would call it, had gone out the window. It was just no longer a feasible idea. But what was being discussed was, how do you then grant a degree of autonomy to the Armenians living in Azerbaijan? And this is absolutely within the spirit of the UN security, of the UN Charter. You know, the UN Charter talks of self-determination, and people often say, oh, but that means independence. It doesn't. It only means independence in very, very limited contexts, and that tends to be a colonial context. And there are very few territories which are colonial these days, and would be candidates for independence. What self-determination means in the context of established states is a right of peoples, to a greater or lesser extent, to run their own affairs. Now, that could be very minor. It could just mean language rights, up to full federal systems, even confederal systems. And that was the sense of, you know, where Azerbaijan did not engage in this process, that they had defeated the attempt by the Armenians living in Nagorno-Karabakh to try and break away and form their own state, or to join with Armenia. That was off the table. You know, the international community had never accepted it. After the war, that just became completely, it just was unrealistic. But Aliyev made it very clear that he wasn't going to be willing to grant them any form of autonomy. That just wasn't going to have it. You know, the position is, you know, as far as I'm concerned, they can have the rights of any other Azerbaijani citizen, and that's where it ends. And, you know, I think that was a very disappointing position to take, to put it mildly. And, you know, there were efforts to try and say, right, okay, what can be done? You know, what can be done to sort of manage this? And, you know, he wanted complete victory over this. He turned on the screws. He imposed a blockade on the Armenians living there. And then ultimately he decided, you know what, I just don't want to even talk about this anymore. I'm just going to march in there. And that's exactly what's happened. And now what we're seeing is, you know, streams of tens of thousands of Armenians leaving from Nagorno-Karabakh. And I think, you know, one of the interesting discussion that's been had, and you know, it's a bit of a, well, so a trailer for my, you know, the topic that I'm hoping to cover in my video this week is exactly, is this ethnic cleansing? Because it raises a really, really interesting discussion about, is, you know, ethnic cleansing is a term that obviously we use, but it's very, very imprecisely defined, and is what we're seeing at the moment. It's actually a very, very complex question. But I think, you know, my view would be that, yeah, I mean, this is one of those cases of, you know, what is legal and what is moral. So Azerbaijan had a legal right to exert its sovereignty, but it didn't have a moral right, you know, to go in there and just say, right, okay, we're not willing to engage in talks anymore, and we're just going to, you know, they'd won. That's the point I think is important to him. They'd already won this. This was unnecessary. This was, you know, a brutal attack that, you know, they didn't need anything more to prove. You know, and it might have taken longer than they liked, and, you know, the Armenians might have been putting up more resistance to some sort of, but ultimately, you know, Azerbaijan said, we're not interested in any sort of autonomy. And, you know, so I think it's really been quite disturbing to see what's been going on. But on the other hand, as I say, again, it's been very telling that the international community has said that, you know, Azerbaijan's right to exert its sovereignty is not in question. It's how it's done it. And many are now arguing, well, you know, then the internationals have, you know, also got to take responsibility for this, because maybe they should have stepped in and be more forceful with Azerbaijan and said, look, you can't do this. So anyway, I mean, it's going to be very interesting to see where this goes from here. And then, you know, there will be questions of, you know, will there be sort of any legal sanctions brought to bear, economic sanctions and stuff? My sense is that there'll be a bit of hand wringing, but ultimately it won't go a lot further. You know, Azerbaijan there won't be a particular price for it to pay over this, but we'll see.
Yeah. So I guess if we link that, that's a really interesting point. You said they're in a place of power. So why, and it's their legal right. So why wouldn't they sort of put their control over it? And I guess you could link that to any other section of a country that is trying to secede. So, say, let's say Catalonia in Spain, or that's just one example. Maybe Kurdish people in Turkey and the other countries there. If a country legally has the rights to say no and to prevent them from leaving, why would they? So, is it even possible for these countries to secede, especially when it's very unlikely, unless the UK with Scotland and maybe Canada with Ottawa? Those are really the only recent independence votes. So is it even possible for this to happen?
I mean, this is such an interesting point because it raises up this fascinating paradox that effectively what we see on the international stage is the countries, the territories that are given the greatest right to secede are the ones that face the least persecution. So, and as I say, it's a strange paradox. So the ones that have the right to secede are the ones that probably need it the least. Scotland, although UK now is obviously been very skittish about giving Scotland another referendum on independence and sort of saying once in a generation, and nobody quite knows what that means in real terms. And Canada is also a really interesting one because, as you said, there were votes on Quebec, and we haven't seen another vote for a very long time. And that's quite an interesting debate in all sorts of ways. But yeah, I mean, the reality is that the international community hates secession. And it loathes unilateral secession. It does not like it when territories try and break away without the permission of what we call the parent state. And I often point out that in the modern international system, there's only been one truly successful unilateral secession, which has sort of went on to become a full member of the United Nations, and that was Bangladesh in 1971. It's remarkably rare. You've got other territories that have managed to secede and break away eventually. But this partly explains again why Kosovo has faced such a tough time since it declared independence, all those years ago. So I mean, it's well over decade and a half now, and it's still recognised by only half the UN because most there is this sort of deep concern about recognising unilateral secession. So it's very, very difficult for countries, for territories that want to have independence to actually, win through. Again, you have a few outliers. I'd sort of mentioned Bangladesh. I think my favorite, if you can talk of having favorite independence movements or ones that succeeded, Eritrea. I've always found absolutely fascinating because that was one of those examples where it had been incorporated into Ethiopia. There'd been a lot of resistance to it. They'd fought a very long war. And essentially what they did is, say we can't get the permission of the central government to break away, which is what we need. So let's overthrow the central government. So having teamed up with other Ethiopian movements that were opposed to the Marxist military regime that existed, they overthrew the government, that military regime in Addis Ababa, and as part of the price for them having played a fundamental role in this was independence. So it was a very, very unusual case, but absolutely fascinating. But on the whole, there's remarkably few examples where secessionist movements, and people would say, oh, what about it's quite interesting. People often don't sort of necessarily understand sort of legal things, so people would sort of talk about what about East Timor. But East Timor was an interesting case because it was a case of thwarted self-determination. I mean, it had the right of independence. It was just it had been invaded and occupied by Indonesia. So it wasn't actually an international challenge. It wasn't seen as a secessionist movement. It was just simply about dealing with what was a very significant regional power in Indonesia and getting Indonesia to accept the principle of an independent East Timor. And in many ways, Palestine would fall under the same heading of that particular class. Western Sahara and Morocco is another example. But as I say, these sort of secessionist movements, very, very few and far between, and very, very rarely are they successful.
Yeah, it's fascinating to think about. So I guess if we go back to what we were talking about before in terms of, uh, not setting the precedent of the strong person being able to just annex territory, do you see if this is thwarted that we'll just be going back to, I guess, proxy wars, which is what we've sort of seen for the last decade or so? Is that where this is going? Is there a way to prevent that from happening? Is there a way to make these countries accountable, or is it just a fact of life that everyone's doing it with this bifurcating world? That's the way that things are going to happen.
I mean, again, I think there's so many difficulties. I mean, are we in a system where the old rules have broken down, and can we restore that respect for international law, which I think is an important starting point if we could get back to that, but it becomes very difficult to see how we can do that now. But as I say, my normative worldview would definitely be in that direction. I know that sort of creates cases of where if countries don't want to give their peoples independence or self-determination, then there's not necessarily a lot that we can do about it. And I think, as I say, so my view would be I would like to see a world where international law and legal principles are strongly adhered to, but I would also like to see a world where we can talk to countries and say to them, you do also have an obligation to grant self-determination to peoples within your borders. So your borders will be protected. The world will recognize the sanctity of your borders, but within them, it's the right thing to do. You want to be giving communities a right to greater freedom of expression in their own language, or to be able to practice their own religions, and not necessarily see this as a threat. So maybe it's a sort of little utopian to sort of view it in that way, but I would say that that's pretty much where I would be coming from in terms of and in cases, if countries are enlightened enough to say, well, let's give you a vote, and if you want to break away, then good luck. We won't stand in the way of it. I mean, I think one of the really interesting things is that we get into the thinking that countries don't want to allow territories to break away, but we rarely think about why countries don't want territories to break away. And there are, in fact, a whole host of reasons. And I've often felt that what we need to be looking at is having the conversation about what is it that really matters. So, if you break it down into different parts, and you look, so I guess in most cases, there's the emotional tie. And as I often point out, if all of us ask, close your eyes and imagine the outline of your country, we can all pretty much do it. I mean, this is stuff that we're brought up with from when we're children. It's drawing the map of our country and everything like that. We've got an image in our mind of what our country looks like. And that's quite a powerful, and it's reinforced in all sorts of weird and wonderful ways. So I often point out that, whenever you look at a weather forecast, you are effectively just usually looking at the map of your country, with pictures of rainfall or sunshine or whatever. But, it's something that's very familiar. So there's an emotional link to it. But then you've got other things. You've got like economic value. Sometimes countries want to hold on to a piece of territory because it's incredibly important for resources. Can actually work the other way, that sometimes, you think, bloody hell, just dot of it. This is costing you a lot and it's not delivering a lot. But, it could have historical or cultural value. That, it could be a site of this piece of territory could be the site of, some sort of, ancient battle or heart of their religious culture or whatever. Sometimes it's a fear that, well, if we let this piece of territory go, then that piece of territory is going to start agitating for independence and secession as well. Sometimes it could be a matter of pride that, for example, in breakaway things like, to return to the example of Azerbaijan and Nagorno-Karabakh, I mean, this was clearly a matter of pride for them that they'd lost the war against Armenia, and this rankled, this ate them up. They wanted to right that historical wrong, to correct that historical humiliating defeat. And they've done that and really wanted to hammer it home that, we were defeated, but now we're the victors. So I think very often when you look at these sort of conflicts, you need to sort of break it down. I don't think we do this enough to try and understand in any particular case, what it is exactly that's driving the wish to hold on to the territory. And sometimes to be able to say, if you want to go, then go. And I think this is one of the great breakthroughs from Northern Ireland, was Britain saying that we've got no strategic interest in Northern Ireland. We're holding on to Northern Ireland because the majority of the people in Northern Ireland want to be British. And of course, the Good Friday Agreement was a recognition of the fact that when that changes, when the majority of people in Northern Ireland want to unite with the rest of Ireland, that will be permitted. And Britain has explicitly signed on the dotted line saying, that's the case. We've got, as I said, no strategic interest. And I think, Scotland, the fact that Britain was willing to offer it a referendum and say, look, here's your chance, if you want it, take it. I think, what's interesting is the number of cases that I wonder if countries would, or territories would, vote for independence when they know they're safe in having it. And we see this a lot with Catalonia, for example. I mean, a lot of the polling has shown that, support for independence runs lower than support for a referendum on independence. It's people feeling, well, I might not want to break away from Spain, but I sure as hell hate the fact that Spain's telling me I don't even get a say on that. And I'm a great supporter in, as I say, sort of working on countries and at least offering self-determination, but hopefully more countries which would be enlightened and say, well, look, let's let people vote on it.
Yeah, it's a great point to make. And as you said, if they vote, then yeah, we've found recently that polling isn't the be all and end all. It's definitely changed. So we've talked about quite a lot of things that happen in the world. Are there any other, I guess, drivers that you're currently seeing that are really going to have a big impact on, I guess, geopolitics moving forward, other than what we've already spoken about? So the Russia-Ukraine conflict and proxy wars.
Well, I mean, obviously the one that a lot of are increasingly nervous about is China-Taiwan, and this is a complex one, because this is one of those situations where, again, law and morality come up against each other, but in quite an unusual way, because it's, obviously Taiwan is too generous. It stands alone in international affairs on the basis of what the issue is really about. It's not a secessionist conflict. Taiwan's not claiming independence. I mean, de facto it is, but officially it's Beijing versus Taipei arguing who is the legitimate government of China. They both actually have an official policy of there is only one China. It's who is the true government of it. So it creates a very odd situation that, if China were to invade Taiwan, legally they'd be saying this is not a violation of China's sovereignty. I mean, China just is simply acting against a region that is making a competing claim. But of course, the reality would be much, much greater than that, and I think would cement a lot of concern about the direction that China is taking, in many Western circles, but also amongst many of China's neighbors. So I think, obviously Taiwan is one of those situations which we're all watching with a great deal of concern. And I think, what the reports that seem to be coming out is that China is getting more and more bellicose and pushing the envelope in terms of sort of military exercises and things like that. And I think there is a real fear. And I mean, that could be a very, very bitter, brutal, bloody war if it takes place. And of course, it then raises the question of whether the United States and other Western countries then would really and truly be willing to step in. And there's been some interesting debates and, articles appearing, sort of arguing both ways, that the West should interfere in the case that China makes an attempt to take Taiwan, and others saying, if it comes to it, hopefully we can hold off China with tough words. But if China really wants to go for it, then we just have to stand back. It's too risky going to war with China. But yeah, so I think that's obviously one to watch, and there's also sort of other hotspots around the world. But I think in terms of sort of the big geopolitics, obviously Ukraine is one with Russia, and then China and Taiwan is the other one that I think we're all watching with a lot of concern about where it's going and where it's taking us.
Yeah, I agree. So, James, thanks so much for your time today. I really appreciate it. We've covered so many topics. So my last question is, what is one message you'd like people to take away from our conversation?
Again, I think it's the value of institutions. I am a great believer in the United Nations. I know that it's an imperfect organization. I've had a lot of contact with the United Nations over the years. I've been a great admirer of it. I know that it works under extremely difficult situations and circumstances, more so than I think most people realize. The constraints that it faces as an institution, the organizational setup of it. But you do hear a lot of people who say, well, we should just scrap it. Good luck. You will never come up with another organization which will be inclusive. And if you say, well, let's have an organization of Western states, democracies, which some people have advocated, that's just going to be a talking shop amongst democracies. What area of communication you're going to have? And this is leaving aside all the good work that the UN does, in terms of specialized agencies and things like that. Is it an organization that can be reformed? Yes. Is it an organization that can be better streamlined, made more efficient? Probably. But is it an organization that we should scrap? Absolutely not. So, and I think, bearing that in mind, as I say, a lot of these arguments about international law respecting the value of trying to find peaceful settlement of disputes, all come into play. And so, I guess I would call myself, my worldview is a sort of legalistic multilateralist at heart. And, I may be idealistic in this day and age and this world, but I do think there's a lot to be found, in looking back at, the end of the Second World War, why we created the United Nations, why we should be protecting it and protecting the system of international law that it was designed to support and encourage.
Yeah, it's a great message to take away. So thanks again for your time today. I really appreciate it. If anyone wanted to find out more about your work, would that best place be YouTube, or is there anywhere else people can find what you do?
Yeah, I guess the channel is probably the best place to go sort of looking for it. I mean, I've got a lot of sort of books, and I've got a book that I published a little earlier this year on secession and state creation. I break down a lot of these issues. It's really accessible. Oxford University Press. Maybe you can put a link to it in the description. It goes by the great title, Secession and State Creation, What Everyone Needs to Know, but it's part of the What Everyone Needs to Know series that Oxford does, which is actually, by the way, a brilliant series. There's all sorts of world issues that are tackled amongst it. So I do take a browse around, but if you're interested in state creation, secession, do take a look at the book, and otherwise the YouTube channel, always grateful for people who come by and spend a little time and get into discussion on what it is that particular week that took my interest to talk about.
Yeah, I'll put that in the description below. And you cover so many amazing, like really interesting topics from the past, the present. I find it interesting. These are short sound bites on quite complex issues. But yeah, James, thanks again for your time.
Thanks so much. Really enjoyed it.
Thank you so much for listening. And if you enjoyed the episode, please subscribe and click the bell icon so you are notified when new podcasts are released. I hope you're leaving with some great value about investing, trading, and finance. See you on the next show.